The Kodak Medalist is one of the more interesting cameras designed by Eastman Kodak, as it was designed to fill a high-end medium format role at what was essentially the beginning of the Second World War. Now, in addition to having an excellent Ektar f3.5 lens, this used a Kodak Supermatic No. 2 shutter, offering speeds of bulb and 1 second to 1/400th of a second. The shutter on these is not difficult to service. However, I was unable to find any kind of tutorial showing how to service this, and that's why I'm putting this video together. Now, you're going to need a couple of tools to service the shutter on the Medalist. Pair of tweezers are going to be handy, a couple of small flathead screwdrivers, and a strap wrench. I'm using this jar opener just because it's handy and it'll work for this application. You may need, depending on how gunked up or how much petrified grease is in your shutter, you may want lighter fluid, Ronsonol or similar, a small brush like this one, and a bit of alcohol, preferably 90% isopropyl or higher. Now, in order to service the Medalist, you do not need to remove the shutter from the focusing helical, nor do you need to remove the focusing helical from the body of the camera. It is probably a good idea to rotate the focusing helical out a bit, although it is not necessary. What I'm going to go ahead and do is take this apart, and then as I put it back together, I will show you how the elements interact and how the shutter functions. So the first step is you're going to want to take your strap wrench, or in this case my jar opener, and we're going to want to remove the front element. There may be a ring on, like this example has, on the front lens element. It is not necessary to remove that. Actually, on this example, that one is stuck in place. Just apply pressure through your strap wrench to the outside of the body and twist, and your lens should unscrew, like so. And you can set that aside. Let me move the camera in here, hopefully get you a better view. Alright, you're going to notice that there are 3 flathead screws that hold the faceplate on the front of the camera that also has aperture markings on it. You're going to want to go ahead and remove these 3 screws. It's a good idea to keep track of your, there's a lot of screws in here, so keep track of them. You can label them, tape them, put them in small bags. I'm just going to organize them kind of as I go, so as not to confuse which screw goes where. Alright, now with those 3 screws removed, you're going to notice that there is a small cutout right here at about the 11 o'clock position. You can insert your screwdriver in there, and then this ring will pop off. It is just brass. There is going to be a bit of grease on this camera because I've already had the shutter apart. Go ahead and set that aside. Alright, now this is the aperture control ring. It rotates here. There are 2 spring steel contacts, one here and one here. We're going to want to carefully remove those. Don't lose those, because otherwise your aperture ring will rotate when you don't want it to. They don't they're not in there with a lot of pressure, so just gently remove them and they won't go springing up. And then with that removed, you can go ahead and remove the aperture control ring. And I'm going to set that over here actually. With that removed, you will notice that there are two black flathead screws that hold this plate on. This plate also on the top here has the markings for shutter speed and aperture. Go ahead and remove those. This plate may be stuck depending on how old your grease is. You can take your screwdriver and gently pry up in the area where the self-timer bar is located, and it should just lift off. There is a piece of spring steel that goes into a recess on the back of the this plate. Keep track of that. There is actually different versions of the shutter. Some have notches cut right here that allow the shutter speed to click stop at predetermined settings. This one doesn't have that, and if it did, that spring steel contact would have a little protrusion in it that would allow those click stops to function. With that plate removed, you can now go ahead and remove the lever and ring that function as the self-timer. They just pull out. You will hear the self-timer unwind a little bit. It is pre-wound a little, meaning we're going to have to wind it a bit over travel when we put this back together, so it'll have enough force to trigger the shutter when it is put back together. With that out of place, this ring, which is what controls the shutter speed, can be lifted off and set aside. Alright, with the shutter speed control ring removed, you're going to notice that there is this locking collar, which tightens down over a thread on the front of the focusing helix and retains this top plate. Before we go any further, we need to remove that. I would recommend removing this piece here, which is part of the 1/400th of a second shutter speed mechanism. That can just lift off. And then there is a spring here, which also will lift off, little coil spring, and just so those don't fall out and go somewhere when you turn the camera. This one has grease, because it has been recently re-greased, has grease on it. There may be grease on your old, if it hasn't been taken a while as well. In order to get a good grip on this with your strap wrench or jar opener, I'm going to recommend you go ahead and use some alcohol and clean the grease off. So I'm just going to take a cloth and a bit of that. And we're just going to clean the grease off of the body. And then you are able to take your strap wrench and fit that around this locking collar. And you can unscrew it. And set that aside. Alright, with that out of the way, we are going to need to start disassembling the shutter mechanism now. There are two parts that need to come off before this, top plate can come off. That is this screw, which retains this small spring here, wire spring, and this bar, which controls the unwinding of the self-timer mechanism. Alright, so the way to remove this is you are going to want to remove this screw, and I'm sorry if can't see through my hands, but loosen the screw. And then remove this wire spring and the screw. Set those aside. This looks a bit kludgy. It's because I'm trying to do this from behind the camera. Alright, then you are going to remove this plate, which is retained by this screw here. I recommend supporting it from the bottom because it is not held in very firmly. It screws into what is essentially the sear of the camera, and just remove that. Set those parts aside. And then we are going to remove this screw, and this screw here in order to remove this top plate. By the way, this is your aperture control lever, which interfaces with the ring removed earlier. By the way, keep track of these three screws because they are not all the same length. And then with those removed, you can go ahead and lift off this top plate, exposing the internals of the shutter. Alright, so I have relocated, so hopefully you can better see. I can better work on the shutter and you can better see without my hands getting in the way. This is the point where if you do not feel comfortable working with small parts, do not proceed, because you can take this apart and be unable to put it back together correctly. If your camera is just sticky with regards to the shutter, you could try just using some lighter fluid on a small brush and cleaning the grease off of these gears in the delay mechanism. That will probably work. If you want to do a full cleaning, I'm going to show you how to do that now. The first thing we're going to remove is this gear right here. This is part of the self-timer mechanism. It is what the ring and lever interface with when the camera is assembled. It has a little spring, coil spring, wound about the bottom. Normally that will interface with this bar right here and put pressure on that. Once you remove the top plate, it will kind of get out of alignment because you're no longer supporting the top pivot. And you will need to reset that once we put the top cover plate back on. Alright, now there are some things we are not going to be able to disassemble here. because they're held together by rivets, and that is mostly the self-timer delay mechanism. Because of this rivet here, you can remove these 2 screws, but I think you would have serious problems getting the gears back into alignment. And since timing is not critical with this part, I would just go ahead and gently clean it if it's sticky and lubricate it, and you should be good to go. So we are going to start by disassembling the gear train for the shutter that controls shutter speed. A smaller screwdriver is going to be handy for these screws on the top of these gear plates, just because these screws are small. There is a little wire spring here that is on the back of this pin, which interacts with the shutter speed ring in order to control the shutter speed. You are going to want to just take tweezers and gently take tension off of it from this pivot point here. And then with your screwdriver, and I know my fingers are in the way still, sorry, we're going to remove these 2 screws. Reminding ourselves to keep track of all of these small parts, because it is not going to be fun if you lose them. And I've just dropped that screw off the side here. Okay, I got it. With those 2 screws removed, we can now remove this plate, which retains the gear train. It does have a half gear mounted to it on the top. I will show you how to align that when we put this back together. You will note that there are a lot of elements that have fallen out because that top cover is off, and I will show you how to align those again. Just for the moment, I would remove them gently and set them aside in the order of which they go back in the camera. So this linkage here can be removed, and then this kind of star-shaped gear, and then this gear here. And if there is grease in here, now would be a good time, once you've removed these, to clean it from the gears with a small amount of alcohol or lighter fluid. And then you can take like a toothpick and drop some oil into these holes. I wouldn't don't coat this, because if you coat the shutter leaves here, they will stick and then the shutter will not close. With that out of the way, we can remove this piece. There is a small spring right here. Just keep track of that so you don't lose it. Alright. Apologize as the camera died on me, so I have rigged up an alternate power solution. Alright, so again, we are not going to remove this gear or any elements of this gear train. I am going to disconnect the spring here, which powers the shutter for all speeds except for 1/400th of a second, which has this and an additional that coil spring removed earlier. This just unhooks from a little tab protruding off the bottom of this plate, and we can kind of rotate that up and out of the way for the time being. The next step is going to be removing, oh, I apologize, the spring is still in the way. I should have just left it where it was, actually, for the time being. Moment. Alright. We're going to remove this toothed lug that moves like this. There is, again, a little wire spring. I would recommend moving it up and over this screw post, as I just did, to remove tension from it. So it won't go flying across the room when you remove this screw. And as we remove this screw, and mind you, I am disassembling this for a reason, and not just because I can. We do want to make sure that the shutter blades are clean and unimpeded. Alright, with that removed, you can go ahead and lift this off, keep track of the coil spring that is in there. And then we're going to go ahead and remove the plate with a shaft that the spring is attached to, and that control with this lever that controls the movement of the shutter blades. There is a nut on top of this post right here. I would recommend you use the proper driver, but I don't have one of the proper size. It's probably not on there tightly, so in this case I'm just going to use a pair of needle nose pliers to loosen it, and then I can unscrew it with my fingers, and off it, that nut post will come. And then I can take my tweezers, make sure the... Oh, I'm sorry, I should add, there is another wire spring that is on the tab at the end of this lever. Just unhook that and let it rest against the body of the focusing. And then we can just lift this whole assembly off its post. And if you want to, I will show you how to remove the sear assembly, but you can access now the unimpeded shutter leaves without removing anything else. If you want to clean the lens element behind it, you can do that now too. Just open the shutter blades, put the aperture at its maximum, and you should be able to do that. But the point I want to make is this little lever controls the opening and closing of the shutter blades. There are 5 of them. They are here. If you get any oil on this, they will stick together, a lot of surface tension there, and they will open and then like half close or partially close, and you'll have light leaks on your film, and you will have a bad day. Alright, so as I was saying, with the elements removed, these shutter blades need to be free to open and close. If they are sticking, if you need to use a judicious amount of force in order to get them to move, I would recommend taking high test alcohol or some kind of white hydrocarbon. I actually like this CRC electronic cleaner because it's just basically quick evaporating alcohol in a spray bottle. Spray it on a little Q-tip, and you can clean these shutter leaves. Make sure they're dry. If it is still sticky, there's this hole here, and you'll see the ring for the aperture, or I'm sorry, for the shutter leaves moving, and you can put a drop or two of oil behind that, and hopefully that will free it up. If you do need to do more service, you can remove the rear element and remove the shutter completely from the body. I'm not going to go into that right now because that is more time than I'm willing to devote, and in most circumstances that will not be necessary. Alright, so the sear assembly is here, and it controls the function of the lever mechanism, which we just removed here, which in turn controls the opening and closing of the blades. There are 3 ways to trigger the sear and thus open and close the shutter. You can use a cable release, you can use the shutter button on the body of the camera, or you can use the self-timer, and this mechanism needs to accomplish all 3 of those. Now, this is the most important spring that you do not want to lose, because if you loosen this screw and without first untensioning the spring, it will go flying across the room. You do not want to be looking for it after it happens. I know from experience. Once you have removed tension from the spring, you can go ahead and take your screwdriver and remove the screw. There is the screw, the spring that is probably going to stick to it. My tools are becoming magnetized for some reason, I don't know why. There's this spring, which is out of shot, this spring here, this screw, and then a washer which goes underneath it and contacts the plate, which moves. This plate actually has 2 main body pieces, and then there is another washer in there as well. With that spring and washer and screw removed, you can gently wiggle up. Oh, and I forgot to mention there is another small coil spring in here as well. Just be aware of that. It shouldn't go shooting off. This will all come off as a unit. Here, let me show you. Alright, this sear mechanism is what we just removed from the camera. You're going to note that it's actually comprised of 4 pieces. There's this silver bar in the middle, this bracket, and if we kind of flip it over, you will note that there is a wire spring attached to the silver bracket, and then if we separate them, you'll note that there is a washer, and that sits on top of the silver bracket. You'll also note that there is a threaded stud here, and that is what this bar that we removed before we took off the top plate, that attaches there, and that is part of the self-timer mechanism. And we're going to go ahead and set those parts aside for reassembly. Alright, with the sear mechanism taken out, you will note that there is not much left inside of the shutter. As I've said previously, we're not going to mess with the self-timer mechanism, short of removing this gear that went here. I would like to point something out, however. If you look carefully, you will note this bar up here. There is a spring that runs down along the side, and there is a little nub that protrudes from a block attached to that bar. This slides in a track, and if I can hold this for the camera to see, you'll note that as I cock, using the manual cocking lever in this instance, or in normal usage you could use the winding knob, but that method of cocking will push this bar clockwise from about the 1130 position to the 1230 position. If I extend this sufficiently and then press the shutter release, I may not be able to because it's locked up right. Oh, there it goes. You will note that that bar moves down, and that is what trips the shutter when you use the button on the top of the camera. And that's about as far as we are going to go with the disassembly. I'm going to show you how to put this back together and show you how each mechanism functions. Alright, so the first step of reassembling the shutter is going to be putting back together the sear assembly. You will note that this bent piece of metal that kind of functions as the trip for the cable release by pushing here, and the self-timer with the mechanism that goes there. Kind of flip that over this way, I find is the easiest way to do that. Sorry for jarring the camera. And then this wire spring needs to have the leg with the non-bent portion positioned so it's in this notch right here. And then with that in place, you can kind of finagle this over and into kind of a three-handed operation here, sorry. So I'm doing it on camera. Like so. And line that up. And don't mind the position of this spring here. It's going to go under this triangular protrusion once it's installed in the camera, but you're not going to be able to hold it in alignment at this point. Take note of this little washer that is going to go on top of the silver bar here. Use a pair of pliers, and then you can take like a toothpick and get everything aligned, and then we will drop this whole thing into the camera. Alright, so with the sear bar and sear kind of bent metal piece, but with the sear assembly reassembled, it is going to go on top of this protruding rod right here. And if you put it on a toothpick, I find this quite easy because you can just position the toothpick on top of that bar and let everything kind of drop down into position. And then I'm trying not to do this with my fingers obscuring it, which is going to be a bit difficult. You kind of want to take this spring now and tuck it under and against the body of the focusing helical, and line up, make sure your silver bar here and your washer and our black metal piece are positioned over everything, and then this and a little tricky here. There we go. That circular cutout just needs to go over the raised protrusion there, and you will have that back on the camera. With that sear assembly replaced on the camera body, we just want to go ahead and replace the spring that powers it. Go ahead and replace the washer. And if my tools were not magnetized, this would be easier. Sorry for jarring the camera. This spring should be positioned with the long leg facing out towards the shutter leaves. I find it easier if you prepare it. Hang on here. By placing the screw into the circular portion of the spring, and then you can line it up pretty well with the camera and tighten it. Oop, and I just didn't mean to put it over this bar, but no harm done. Like so. And then we can go ahead and tighten this. You want it not extremely tight. The most of these screws and nuts are brass, so don't tighten to the point where you strip off screws, but just tight enough so that it's not going to rotate from use. And then take your tweezers and move that up, and so it's pressing against the self-timer. And what you should get, and I've over-tightened it slightly, I may need to exercise this slightly. Is that this should move freely. Sorry, the reason that was binding, I just confirmed it should move freely like so, is that I did not cock the shutter lever and it was binding against that. So you want to make sure that lever is at least in its retention position and not in the position after you have pressed the shutter button. And then this should spring back once tension is taken off. Alright, the next step is to put on the lever and I don't know what you'd call this quite. Trigger? Maybe the hammer? Anyway, the mechanism that rotates around this shaft with the spring and grabs a hold of the shutter leaf bar here. I would probably, before assembly, you want to clean this if it's really dirty on your example, if there's a lot of grease in there. I'm just going to go ahead and apply a bit of white oil to the shaft with my toothpick and then slide that down on top. And then we can go ahead and replace the nut that we took off earlier. And I apologize, you can't see through my fingers. And then tighten, and we are good to go. Don't over torque it. Again, pliers probably not the best tool, but it's what I have. Alright. Now you will need to pull back the sear bar a bit in order to get this to rotate sufficiently. And kind of a three-handed affair. Pull it back slightly and push on the cocking lever just a touch, and you will get it into a position like so, where it is just this bar has gone far enough into its recess that I can put the spring, wire spring back on it. but not that it's catched here. When we cock the shutter, it'll this lever will come up and grab the shutter leaf lever a bit more. And then we can go ahead and take the end of the spring and hook it back up over on its little hook there, again on the plate that retains the gearbox for the self-timer mechanism. And you will note as I push on the cocking lever, that bar we saw move in the top is going to go ahead and impinge on this rotating plate, and as it does, it will both put tension on this spring, and it will rotate and move that lever into a position where it grabs the shutter leaf lever, and then if I go ahead and press the shutter button, it will go ahead and release the spring tension, open the shutter blades, and then once I release it'll close it. The shutter is stuck because I don't have the delay mechanism installed yet. The shutter will operate somewhat erratically. It'll either, depending on how much pressure I put on the shutter button up here. If I push it quickly, it'll fire rapidly, and if I do it slowly, it'll kind of hold it open for bulb exposures. Alright, so the next step is going to be installing the delay mechanism for the shutter lever. First step of which is going to be replacing this bracket, which controls this triangular piece, which moves in and out to one of the gear in relation to this star-shaped gear. And in doing so, determines how much time it takes for the mechanism to go through, and thus how long the shutter blades are open. So keep in mind that this bracket has a spring, a little coil spring. The smaller end of that spring, you want it kind of with the wound part facing towards the open end of this bracket, and the small end should go in towards the side of the bracket, closed side of the bracket, and then that can just slip over. Oh, apologies, I have dropped the spring. Oh. So you want the big coil, or the longer part of the wire spring facing out and towards the body of the camera, and we can just slip that over like so. And I'm going to wait until I have the top plate on this gear assembly before I tension the spring over this bar here, just so it won't start shooting things across the room. Then we're going to put on this triangular piece. You want the side that has the more pronounced kind of bushing facing upwards. And I'm not doing so well with my tweezers here. Hang on. Like so. And we can just kind of move that out of relation for now. Alright, then we are going to take the second gear down that has a larger bottom portion and a narrower top portion, and insert that in its slot. Again, if you've got a lot of grease in your mechanism, it would be a good idea to clean these with alcohol or somewhere before reassembly. You can also take, this one has been lubricated already, so I'm not too worried, but you can take a little bit of oil and put it in these holes where the gears rotate for assembly. And then we can take this star-shaped gear, which has a small, finer toothed gear on the bottom, and place it in its hole. And I apologize if this is kind of clunky, because I'm trying to do this from behind the camera. And so I cannot see quite so well. But like so. If the tool did not just pick it up again. Like so. Alright, and then we have a brass gear, which has a tall shaft on the bottom, and that is going to be the third in line, interfacing with the second gear. And then, before we put the cover plate on it, we are going to replace this toothed bracket, and its spring is still sitting inside of it, but I'll pull it out. Looks like that. You want the bent portion facing out in relation to the closed portion of the bracket. Now let me see if I can get it so my fingers aren't in the way. Alright, so this bracket has an open portion, and we just want the flat side of the spring to go in like so, so this little bent portion is out. And then we are going to take this and replace it on its shaft. And yes, I know my fingers are in the way, like so. And there we go, a little bit of judicious wiggling, and it will fit above its, it will fit onto its shaft. And you will notice that there is a little protrusion on the back of this, and it can rotate. And what's going to happen is that is going to catch on this plate when it cocks. And I will show you that right after I put the screw on, so it doesn't go flying across the room. Oh dear. Drop the screw. Alright, like so. And then you can go ahead and tuck the spring back against this bar. A little tricky here to get it over the top, but not impossible. Like so. And so that will just tension this bar so it wants to move towards, so the geared portion wants to move towards the focusing helical body. And so we have, what happens is you'll note as we cock the shutter and that plate rotates, it's going to move like so. And then as we hit the shutter button, or I can't because I focus this in a bit, is going to catch on the body of this and prevent it from rotating until it's pushed. Alright, the final step is going to be to replace the cover plate over the shutter speed delay mechanism. And the way we're going to want to do that is there is a gear, half gear, and smaller gear on top of this plate, or actually it's on the top of the bottom portion depending on how you look at it. But we want that so the half moon is as far rotated counterclockwise as we can get it. It will hit this bar, so we are going to do so. And place it gently because these gears are not quite going to mesh. And gently, you're going to probably need to do a little bit of playing and wiggling with this to get it right. Because every gear here is going to want to try and fit into the top plate at a different point in time. And I think I got them all. Yep. Just make sure all of the small shafts go into their respective holes. And then we're going to take our fine screwdriver and replace the 2 screws going to the top here. Sorry. You're probably not going to be able to see this. This is kind of difficult just to get these screws tightened, but it's fairly straightforward. Just making sure the plate is lined up and that these screws are in position. Like so. Alright, with that back together, again I'm bumping the camera, I apologize. I'm just going to go ahead and tuck the spring over this shaft, and that's going to put tension on our bracket here. And this is what this basically is an escapement mechanism as you would find on a clock. And by pushing on this bar right here, pushing on the shaft, which is normally done by the shutter speed ring, I am shifting the spacing between the escapement bracket and the gear train and decreasing the amount of time it takes to rotate. So if I go ahead and cock the shutter, you're going to note that the bar in the top is going to turn. This bracket put tension on the spring. This bracket with the teeth on it is going to be pushed by its spring here. Now that this bracket has gotten out of the way, out towards the body of the focusing helical, and it is spring. We can wind the gear train here, and you can see it functions. And when I hit the shutter button, you will note that once the shutter is cocked and the button is pushed, this plate is going to rotate and be impeded by the tab on this bracket. And the reason it is stopping is because I do not have anything pushing against the escapement here. So it is going at the slowest speed possible. The way I can show you to simulate the shutter, because it's a very small movement of this bar that results in the change in shutter speed. If I do nothing, it just seizes up. If I go ahead and put on the top plate just temporarily and place the shutter in kind of the mid-range, as the mechanism unwinds, this bar will move outwards. It will stop on parts of this shutter speed ring which are sized to fit in relation to different shutter speeds. And so if I do that, and this is also, by the way, up here, this is affecting the travel of this bracket. So if I do that, then the shutter will close at different rates depending on where I move it to. That's a slower speed. If I go ahead and move it up a bit, that's a little bit faster. And this isn't perfect because I don't have the retaining ring on top. There we go, there's a faster shutter speed. So that is controlling, the ring here is controlling the movement of this and of this in order to change shutter speed. Alright, so with that all installed, we can go ahead and put this mostly back together. Oh, there's one thing I should point out, are the three ways in which the shutter is triggered. We already know the first way is via the lever up here that moves with the trigger button on the camera, and what that is doing is that is going to push backwards, or I guess downwards, against the plate here, like that, and trip the shutter. Another way it is going to do that, and I'm going to show you that, is via the self-timer, and the self-timer is going to pull down via its mount here, and this metal bracket is a component of the self-timer delay feature. And then the third way to do that is via the screw hole in the side of the camera, which is used for a cable release, and that again pushes against that black metal plate, tripping the shutter. Alright, the final piece we need here is this gear, if I grab my tweezers, which is part of the winding mechanism, and it contains the spring that powers the self-timer. And that is going to situate itself here, down in the bottom at about the 6 o'clock position, and be positioned accordingly. There is a spring here, and it has a leg. Because this top piece is not held in until we put the cover plate on, I'm not going to go ahead and adjust the spring anymore right now until I have that cover plate on, and then is going to go. It's going to be hard to show you, so I'll just point it out now. You're going to need to tuck that over against this support for the self-timer, but what I can show you is once that you've wound that, it's going to apply force to this gear train and wind it like so. And that's what's causing your delay for the self-timer. Alright, now I'm just going to go ahead and pull that gear out and reposition it with the projection of the spring at, I don't know, about 10 o'clock. And then we're going to go ahead and put the cover plate on. Making sure that everything that needs to protrude is protruding. Making sure that the shaft on the top of that gear is lining up with its hole. And that everything is nice and snug. And then we are going to go ahead and put the 3 retaining screws back in. The one at about the 1 o'clock position is the shortest of the 3, if you have lost track of which is which. And then the other 2 that go at the 4:30, 5 o'clock position are longer. I think they're the same length actually. I may have cross-threaded that one a bit. Hang on. There we go. And if it's nice and tight, they're all nice and tight, we can then go ahead and put the retaining ring back on. And that is just going to be screwed on top of the focusing helical. And you'll note that there are actually some small cuts made in the back of this retaining ring. Those would be for a special tool to unscrew this that Kodak would have. Obviously, 70 or odd years down the line, we no longer have access to that, hence the use of the rubber jar opening tool. Get it nice and finger tight. And then if you tuck your tool over, you should be able to get it a bit tighter. Don't torse it on. There's no reason to strip threads here. Just nice and tight to the point where you can't loosen it with your fingers. Like so is perfectly acceptable. Alright, it's hard to show on camera because it's in the shadow, but you just want to make sure that you tuck that protruding wire spring over the support shaft for the self-timer cover plate, and so that once it winds, it's not going to be pulling that spring into the gear train. Alright. Now, with that in place, we can go ahead and put on the remaining elements of the shutter, which are going to be this plate, which is the sear for the self-timer, and that is going to be positioned right here. Make sure you slip it over that part of the sear, and then replace its screw. Which is a little challenging. Most of this is a little challenging. And like I said before, you want this a little bit tight, but not so much that you're stripping screws. You may want to support it from the bottom just so you can tighten it sufficiently without bending the sear. And that's good. and then we want to replace its wire spring and its screw. Again, I'm just going to put the screw onto the spring beforehand. Like so. Bring it in so I can kind of manipulate it and set it in its hole. Come on, cooperate. Move the aperture lever out of the way. And then don't tighten it yet, just get it on there. And then you're going to want to move the wire spring over onto its position behind the little lump right here. There, and just so it tucks on there. And then just put a little inwards pressure on it and tighten the screw. And then that should put spring pressure onto that sear bar, like so. Then we can go ahead and drop in the 1/400th of a second auxiliary coil spring, and it's not really it's not quite a weight. It looks like a weight, but what it is it's actually going to interact with the shutter speed ring and put pressure on this coil spring. You'll note that the coil spring has a portion that sticks out perpendicular to the rest of the spring coil, and a portion that is going to point down along the axis of the spring coil. This is going to be hard to see, but let's see if you can see it. There is a small hole which is going to be partially concealed by the coil spring here. And you may be able to see it at the very bottom. It's in about the 9 o'clock position with the shutter uncocked. And what we're going to do is we're going to put the portion of the spring that sticks down along the axis of the coil, and that is going to go down on the shaft, and I'm trying to, I think I got it. Not quite. I may have to do this off camera just so I can see what I'm doing. Hang on. Alright, sorry about that. Kind of difficult to do looking at the back LCD of my digital camera here. So you're going to put that on, make sure that's down the shaft. That's going to cause this protruding element, finger of the spring if you will, to go off at about the 8 o'clock position. And then this weight is going to go on top like so. And so it is going to push against that coil spring. The next step is going to be to replace the shutter speed setting ring. And what you're going to want to do, and I've done off camera just for the sake of time, is apply a little bit of light grease around the perimeter, especially on the top of the retaining ring here, and that is going to just reduce friction with the shutter speed setting ring, give you a little bit easier to get between and stop on the correct settings. If your camera is one that features click stops, I would recommend it, but it's probably not as necessary. And you are going to want to set that. Make sure that your aperture lever is fitting through its slot. Make sure that the sear bar here is not being pushed down by this, and make sure both of your levers here for the shutter speed escapement gearing are being impinged by their cuts in this lever and not pinned under it. Alright, now we are going to go ahead and replace the cocking lever ring for the self-timer, and then I'm going to show you how this whole mechanism works. And if you have taken apart the self-timer and it has unwound the self-timing gear mechanism, we are going to need to wind this a bit in addition to the normal range of travel. I'm going to recommend, if you note the gear travel here, wind it about an additional third of this length. So I'm going to show you how to do that. Just go ahead and put it at the beginning and wind it about a third like that, and then you can pop this off. This here is putting pressure on, this bar here puts pressure on the escapement for the self-timer. So as long as this ring is off, it will be wound, and I just unwound it slightly, so I will wind it a bit more, and I just popped the shutter speed ring off a bit. Alright, so now that ring is on, you're going to want to make sure that clears this lever, which retains. You'll note that is currently, or you may not be able to see that, hang on. You're going to note that there is a cam surface here, and it ends in a flat area on the self-timer ring, and that there is a little hook here, and what that hook is doing is it's going to interface with the cocking mechanism, and when I cock the camera, that hook will lift and allow you to wind the self-timer mechanism. Now, you will also note that there is a similar thing over here, and what that is doing is pushing against this so the self-timer does not actuate unless it is cocked, and which is what I'm going to show you. Alright, with that assembled and the self-timer assembly wound sufficiently, I'm going to now show you the function. Keep in mind that this bar here is attached to the sear assembly, and this protrusion down here is going to be interfacing with the self-timer gear train, and preventing its movement until it is pushed outwards. So what I'm going to do is cock the camera. That is going to free that bar in the top there, which will then allow me to wind the self-timer. And now that the self-timer is wound, there is nothing pushing against this bar, so it is going to lock up the self-timer escapement mechanism until I hit the shutter button. When the shutter button is pressed, it is going to push down on the sear, which is going to cause this lever to move slightly downward and catch on a protrusion here. As this unwinds, it is going to pull and eventually pull the sear, causing the shutter to fire, and then it will release, reset the shutter, and go back to its ordinary state. Fairly simple, fairly clever. The next portion here, and the last relevant portion before we go ahead and button this thing back up, is the speed setting for 1/400th of a second. And what that's going to do is, you will note, when I cock the shutter, and recall that when I cock the shutter, there is a plate under here that is going to rotate and put tension on this coil spring that is under this plate. When it does that, we keep in mind that we have this weight slash it's really just an interface between this ring and the spring, coil spring we have there, is also attached to that plate. You'll notice when I cock the shutter, that is going to move upwards. And when it does, it is going to present this bar in an upwards fashion. If we go ahead and rotate the shutter speed ring all the way to 1/400th of a second, you're going to note that the protruding portion of the shutter speed ring is going to put pressure against this brass piece, which is going to put more tension on that spring and thus on that plate, which is attached to the lever that controls the opening and closing of the shutter blades here. So basically what it's doing when you go to 1/400th of a second is that it increases spring tension on the lever that jerks the shutter blades. It actually does not function in relevancy to the delay train here. And when you do that, fairly quick, it occurs to me you may not be able to see the shutter blades opening and closing because of the frame rate of the digital camera in relation to the opening and closing speed of the shutter blades. Hopefully it comes out. But that is how that functions. The last portion we're going to do here is go ahead and reassemble the shutter. You're going to want to make sure that your shutter speed ring is fully seated on top of the plate, as is your self-timer, winding disc. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank here. It's been this has been a long video. The self-timer ring and lever, and then we are going to go ahead and take the control plate. You're probably going to want to go ahead and grease the top, the back of this plate and the top of the shutter speed ring before you put this together. And do not forget that there is this wire piece, or this small flat spring, and that is going to go in this cutout on the back of this disc that has the shutter speed and aperture markings. This is especially important if your shutter has the cutouts for stops at each of the shutter speeds, as this piece has the protrusion that will lock into each shutter speed, so you won't have that if you forget to put the spring in. A little grease over the top of that is a handy thing. I'm doing this off camera, I apologize. Just to keep it in place while you flip it over and put it on the camera. Dab of grease or so. I'm using silicone grease, but it probably doesn't matter. Just don't put so much excess that it will run down your hands when you take it out in the summer, or get on the lens. Just enough so that everything rotates smoothly. And then we can go ahead and replace this ring on top here, making sure to line it up with the screw holes for it. And I recommend going ahead and putting some pressure on the top of this and rotating your shutter speed ring just to make sure that it is not binding. Then go ahead and take the screws for this and reattach this plate. and you should be in business. The next step is going to be to replace the aperture control ring. Again, I recommend a little bit of grease on the inside of this. Just make sure you get this cut out in the bottom right there, over the shutter, or I'm sorry, the aperture lever, and tuck it under the self timer, and you should be able to control your aperture like that. Remember, there are two spring steel little pieces of metal that are going to go in those cutouts I just pointed to. They're going to go with the concave side facing outwards, like so, in there. And I'm just going to press those in, and that just helps this ring not to slide around when you do not want it to. A little bit of finger pressure here. You're not going to be able to see this behind my fingers, but I'm just going to kind of go in with one side, tuck it in, and then press it in with my finger, kind of tuck in the other side with my tweezers here. And then you will have spring pressure on your aperture control ring. The last step is going to be to replace the marcation plate. Again, there is a cutout right here that winds up with the little tab in the center there. And you, again, probably want to put a bit of grease on this so the aperture ring is sliding smoothly. Just make sure you line up this plate like so. And I've probably just got a bit of grease on it, but oh well. And then we can go ahead and replace the 3 flathead screws that go about the perimeter. Whoops. Careful. Don't damage the shutter blades. Let me try to do this so you can see it, and I'm not. And tighten those 3 screws down, and then I would suggest going ahead and testing your shutter, cocking it, and then let's go for a 1 second exposure. Looking good. Half second exposure, still looking good. 5th second exposure, a 10th. Good. 25th, 50th, 1/100th, 1/200th, and 1/400th of a second. Hey, your shutter's working. Good job. And then, finally, go ahead and replace the front element of the lens. beautiful Ektar lens on this camera. Tighten. Again, if you don't use filters on this, it's probably not necessary to do anything more than hand tighten this. But if you are using filters that screw in, probably just getting it a little bit tighter so you don't accidentally screw out the front element of your lens in the field isn't a terrible thing. And just like so I can't unscrew it by hand. And you have just successfully serviced the lens and the shutter on your Kodak Medalist camera. Good job.